Some women enter history through a throne, some through a scandal, some through a speech that changes the world. Diana Cooper entered through a doorway. A room would be moving in its usual rhythm, glasses lifting, voices overlapping, political jokes floating above the smoke, and then the rhythm changed. Not because she demanded attention, not because she announced herself, but because people looked. At first, that was all the world gave her: attention, a face in the room, a name in the papers, a young woman described before she was understood. Beauty became the headline, the introduction, the currency everyone thought they could spend on her behalf. But Diana Cooper's life is not a story about being beautiful. It is a story about what a woman does after the room has already turned toward her. Because visibility is not influence. Visibility is only the open door. Influence begins with what you build after you walk through it. And across nearly a century of change, from Edwardian drawing rooms to the trenches of the First World War, from the stage lights of London to the broken streets of liberated Paris, Diana learned how to convert being seen into being remembered. She was born in 1892 into a world that knew exactly what it expected from women like her. Diana grew up surrounded by conversation, art, wit, and expectation. But the expectation was the strongest thing in the house. A girl could be educated in languages, manners, music, literature, and social instinct. Yet the final lesson was always the same. Your life will be judged by how well you fit inside the frame prepared for you. And Diana did not fit quietly. By the time she entered society, London had already begun to make a myth out of her. Newspapers loved her face. Artists wanted to capture her. Men wanted to stand near her. Women watched how she moved, how she spoke, how she made attention look effortless. But attention can become a cage. When the world calls a woman beautiful, it often pretends it has finished describing her. It reduces a whole intelligence to a surface. It mistakes being looked at for being known. For women of Diana's generation, beauty was often treated as destiny. Society rewarded appearance, while quietly overlooking competence. Many women learned that if they wanted influence, they first had to work through expectations they had never chosen. Diana understood this danger early. She could have become a passive ornament in other people's stories. Instead, she became a connector. Her beauty brought people close. Her mind made them stay. In the years before the First World War, she moved among a brilliant, restless circle of young aristocrats, writers, politicians, soldiers, and dreamers. They were clever, dazzling, sometimes reckless. They lived as if the old world would last forever because almost no one believed how quickly it could burn. Diana was not simply present in that circle. She was central to its emotional gravity. People gathered around her because she made a room feel alive. She listened sharply. She laughed without calculation. She could be playful without becoming trivial. She knew how to make powerful men feel seen and nervous young people feel included. Long before she held any official role, she was learning one of the oldest forms of power, the power of atmosphere. Influence does not always begin at a podium. Sometimes it begins at dinner. Sometimes it begins in a letter. Sometimes it begins when the right people feel they can speak freely in your presence. History rarely records this kind of leadership. Formal power was usually held by men, while women often shaped the conversations around that power without receiving the same recognition. Diana understood how much history could be influenced long before history was officially written. Then came 1914. The summer light faded into uniforms, departure platforms, telegrams, and empty chairs. The world that had praised Diana for being radiant now began taking away the people who had gathered around that radiance. Friends went to war. Young men who had filled rooms with jokes and arguments became names in casualty lists. The charming circle of youth became a circle of ghosts. This is where Diana's story changes. Not with a single dramatic decision, but with grief. The First World War did not merely interrupt her youth. It stripped away the illusion that beauty, charm, class, or intelligence could protect anyone from history. The rooms were still there. The names were still printed. But behind the glitter was a silence that would never fully leave. Diana had to learn something leadership always teaches eventually. Attention is fragile, but character is built under pressure. In 1919, after the war had broken so many expectations, she married Duff Cooper. It was not the safe choice many had imagined for her. Duff was clever, ambitious, brave, difficult, and far from the grand dynastic match expected of a woman placed so high in the public imagination. To some, the marriage looked like a mistake. To Diana, it was a decision made from the life she wanted, not the life others had arranged. She chose partnership over approval, and that partnership became one of the central engines of her influence. Duff had political ambition. Diana had visibility, social intelligence, emotional courage, and a network that crossed the borders between politics, literature, theatre, aristocracy, and journalism. Together, they became more than a couple. They became a platform. But Diana did not simply stand beside him as decoration. She worked. In the 1920s, when money was not as endless as outsiders assumed, she did something that shocked many people from her background. She went on the stage. The decision was more than professional. It was symbolic. The same world that enjoyed watching her in private rooms suddenly had to watch her under public lights. She stepped out of the controlled setting of society and into performance, where applause had to be earned again and again. In The Miracle, she appeared before audiences in Britain, Europe, and America. The stage transformed her beauty into discipline. The audience may have arrived to see a famous face, but theatre demanded timing, stamina, memory, movement, and nerve. Night after night, she learned the difference between being admired and holding attention. That difference would matter later. Diana's stage years sharpened the very skills that society had mistaken for natural gifts. Then, as Duff's political life expanded, Diana's role changed again. In 1924, she helped him campaign for Parliament in Oldham. Picture the scene. Not a private drawing room, not a glittering theatre, but streets, voters, handshakes, local meetings, practical persuasion. Beauty might make people glance. It could not make them vote. For that, Diana needed warmth, resilience, and the ability to meet people outside her own world without condescension. Here, visibility became useful only because she attached it to effort. She was no longer just the woman people wanted to see. She was the woman showing up. This is the first great leadership turn in her life. She understood that attention becomes influence only when it is placed in service of a goal. In the years between the wars, Diana became a kind of unofficial bridge across British public life. She knew politicians, writers, actors, editors, aristocrats, diplomats, soldiers, and social rebels. She moved between worlds that often distrusted one another. She could speak the language of glamour, but also the language of loyalty. She could host a dinner that looked effortless while quietly placing people beside the very person they needed to meet. Diana's gift was not simply that she knew everyone. It was that she understood the emotional weather between people. She built networks before networking became a business word. And she built them not by collecting names, but by creating spaces where names became relationships. That is influence. Still, the public expectation never disappeared. The world wanted her to remain dazzling, witty, available, charming, and young. It wanted the old Diana, the beauty, the idol, the sparkling figure who made people feel that the pre-war world had not vanished. But time does not negotiate. Youth changes, politics hardens, marriage becomes complicated, reputation has to be renewed. Diana faced the challenge every public figure eventually faces. How do you remain relevant when the thing that first made people notice you begins to fade? Her answer was not to chase youth. Her answer was to deepen meaning. She became more useful. When Britain moved toward another war, the glitter of the 1920s and 1930s began to look thin against the shadow gathering over Europe. Duff Cooper was among those who understood early that appeasement would not stop Hitler. His political stance came at a cost. Diana stood inside that cost too. Diana knew how to do that work. During the Second World War, the grand performance of society gave way to practical survival. Food shortages, rationing, blackouts, uncertainty, the old markers of status mattered less when everyone was listening for sirens. At Bognor, she turned land into use. She raised animals, grew food, kept bees, made butter and cheese. The image is almost cinematic because it breaks the myth. The celebrated beauty, once framed in silk and flashbulbs, now dealing with mud, livestock, and wartime necessity. But this was not a fall from glamour. It was an expansion of identity. She volunteered. She worked. She adapted. And adaptation is one of the clearest signs of lasting leadership. Many people can shine in the world they were trained for. Fewer can remain effective when that world disappears. Diana could. Then came the diplomatic chapter that would define her mature influence. In 1944, Duff Cooper was connected to Britain's relationship with the Free French leadership. The war had shifted from survival to rebuilding. France was wounded. Trust between governments was delicate. Personal relationships mattered because official structures were still fragile. In Algiers, Diana saw British officials and staff living under strain, far from home, often uncomfortable, often lonely. She could have treated her role as ceremonial. Instead, she turned hospitality into morale. She created a place of welcome. A house can be more than a house in wartime. It can be a refuge, a place where exhausted people remember they are human, a place where conversation returns after days of pressure, a place where alliances stop being abstract and become faces across a table. This was Diana's genius. She understood that soft power is not soft because it is weak. It is soft because it enters through doors that force cannot open. In September 1944, after the liberation of Paris, Duff and Diana arrived in a city still carrying the smell of occupation. The British Embassy, closed since 1940, had to come back to life. Paris was free, but freedom did not instantly repair hunger, suspicion, grief, or political tension. Imagine the embassy rooms being opened again. Dust disturbed, furniture uncovered, staff moving through halls that had waited through years of war. Outside, a city trying to decide what it would become after humiliation and resistance, collaboration and courage, hunger and celebration. Into this atmosphere came Diana Cooper, not as a young beauty now, not as a stage sensation, not as a symbol of Edwardian glamour. She arrived as something far more valuable, a woman with decades of accumulated reputation. People trusted the name before they entered the room. And in post-war Paris, she turned that trust into diplomatic capital. The British Embassy became more than an office. It became a social crossroads. Writers, politicians, diplomats, artists, soldiers, officials, Old friends, new power brokers, they passed through rooms where food, conversation, warmth, and wit did what formal meetings could not always do. Diana did not sign treaties, she did not sit at the official desk, but she helped create the conditions in which relationships could survive the strain of policy. This is one of history's recurring blind spots. Women's diplomatic labor has often happened in the spaces between official meetings through hospitality, trust, emotional intelligence, and relationship building. Because it left fewer signatures on paper, it was too often dismissed as merely social, even when it helped make diplomacy possible. That is the invisible architecture of influence. She knew the power of welcome. She knew the power of memory. She knew that people often decide whether they trust a nation after deciding whether they trust a person. In 1954, Duff died. For Diana, the loss was not only personal, it closed a long chapter of partnership, ambition, endurance, and shared public life. She had spent decades beside a man whose career placed her near the center of British politics and diplomacy. Now she had to decide who she was without that structure. Once again, she adapted. She returned to the name by which the world knew her best, Lady Diana Cooper, not as a retreat into the past, but as a reclaiming of identity. She had been many things: daughter, beauty, actress, wife, hostess, wartime worker, diplomatic partner, but the name carried the full archive of her life. Old age did not erase her magnetism. It changed its form. Visitors still came. Friends, writers, relatives, admirers. They entered her rooms as if visiting a living archive. The century had changed around her. Empires weakened. Wars reshaped borders. Aristocratic society lost much of its old authority. Women's lives widened in ways her youth could barely have imagined. And still, Diana remained interesting. Not because she refused to age, not because she clung to old glamour, but because her life contained a rare continuity. She had carried herself through multiple worlds without becoming trapped in any single one. That is the deeper leadership lesson. Relevance is not preserved by staying the same. It is preserved by knowing what must remain constant while everything else changes. For Diana, the constant was not youth. It was presence. She knew how to be present in a room, present in a crisis, present in a friendship, present in a public role, present in memory. Her beauty created visibility, but visibility alone would have disappeared quickly. What made her life durable was how she converted visibility into connection, connection into trust, and trust into influence. Her arena was the room, and she understood that rooms shape history more often than history likes to admit. Before public decisions are announced, people meet. Before alliances are formalized, people test one another. Before reputations become secure, people tell stories. Before influence becomes visible, it usually moves quietly through relationships. Diana Cooper mastered that quiet movement, and she did it while navigating a world that constantly tried to define her from the outside. She shows that being seen is not the same as being powerful. Many people today confuse visibility with influence. They count attention as achievement. They mistake applause for trust. They believe that being known means being respected, and being admired means being effective. Diana converted it. She used beauty to enter the room, but she used intelligence to stay there. She used charm to open conversations, but loyalty to sustain them. She used hospitality, not as decoration, but as strategy. She used reputation not as vanity, but as a long-term asset. And by the end of her life, the image of the beautiful young woman had become only the first frame in a much larger film. The real story was not the face people turned to see. The real story was the network she built after they turned, the trust she earned after they smiled, the influence she carried after the titles changed, the reputation that kept growing long after youth had gone. 3 leadership lessons remain. First, visibility is not influence. For women especially, history has often confused visibility with value. Diana's life reminds us that lasting influence comes not from being admired, but from becoming indispensable. Visibility can be given by beauty, status, money, publicity, or timing, but influence must be earned through action. Diana was seen early, but she became influential only when she attached that visibility to work to campaigning, hosting, connecting, adapting, and representing something larger than herself. Attention may open the door, only contribution keeps it open. Second, relationships are a strategic asset. Diana's network was not a list of impressive names. It was a living system of trust. She moved between politics, culture, diplomacy, and society because she understood people. She knew that relationships are built before they are needed, and that a warm room can sometimes achieve what a cold office cannot. Power does not always announce itself. Sometimes it pours the tea, chooses the seating, remembers the grief, and makes the introduction. Third, reputation compounds over time. A reputation is not built in one season. It is built through repeated signals, courage in one moment, loyalty in another, usefulness in another, grace under pressure in another. Diana's early fame could have faded with youth. Instead, her reputation deepened because she kept adding substance to the image. By the time she reached Paris, people were no longer responding only to who she had been. They were responding to everything she had become. And perhaps that is the final reflection. A beautiful face can make a person visible for a moment, but only a life of presence can make a person unforgettable. Diana Cooper began as the woman everyone looked at. She ended as the woman many people remembered, not because she was seen, but because in some crucial moment at a table, in a crisis, after a war, inside a friendship, she made them feel that history still had a human face.